Seeing it can't outmaneuver Trump, Canada changed its approach. Ottawa announced plans to impose tariffs on Chinese products. China is prepared for countermeasures. Why is Canada targeting China? How should China respond? Hello everyone, I'm Quan. Welcome to Global Overview. On July 16th, the Canadian government announced a 25% tariff on steel and related products from China. It will also adjust the tariff quota system for countries without a free trade agreement, restricting import volume and raising tariff rates. Canadian Prime Minister Carney stated that this measure is intended to prevent a large influx of cheap foreign steel into the Canadian market after the United States raised its tariffs, which would impact domestic industries. In his speech, he directly named China, claiming that China has a so-called overcapacity problem and listed China as one of the main countries to watch out for. According to Carney, after the U.S. increased tariffs, some countries' steel products began seeking alternative export markets. Canada faces pressure from a large influx of foreign steel. Some countries exploit free trade loopholes to circumvent regulations, pressuring the Canadian market. However, this claim is merely an excuse for tariff increases. The Canadian government's move is a passive response to the Trump administration's new trade policies. Starting in May, Trump announced tariff increases of 35% to 50% on Canadian products like steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, and pharmaceuticals. In addition, the U.S. accused Canada of not cooperating on the fentanyl issue, and even went so far as to openly threaten to annex Canada as the 51st state of the United States. Faced with this pressure, Canada initially tried to ease tensions through compromise. First, it announced the cancellation of the digital tax on American tech companies, and then agreed to increase its defense and border security budgets. However, these efforts still failed to sway Trump. On July 10th, Trump published an open letter to Carney on social media, once again emphasizing that starting August 1st, a 35% tariff would be imposed on Canadian goods. He also stated that if Canada raised retaliatory tariffs, the U.S. would further increase its tariffs. Facing Trump's tariff stick, Canada lacked both bargaining chips and alternative markets. As a result, it began to reassess its strategic priorities. With continued pressure from the domestic steel industry and Trump's refusal to compromise, the Carney administration chose to target Chinese products. The logic was that by restricting steel quotas from China and other non-free trade partner countries, Canada could demonstrate a tough stance externally, thereby easing dissatisfaction among its own citizens and businesses, while also showing cooperation to Trump in hopes of persuading him to show some leniency. However, this move also comes with obvious risks. On one hand, China is the world's largest steel producer and Canada's third-largest source of steel imports, accounting for over 10% last year. Imposing tariffs on Chinese products would directly impact import costs and domestic prices. In other words, it could drive up steel costs for the construction and manufacturing industries, which would actually be detrimental to Canada's own economic stability. On the other hand, potential countermeasures from China cannot be ignored. As early as June, the Ministry of Commerce had already pointed out that the so-called reciprocal tariffs imposed by the United States on other countries are a typical example of unilateralism. China firmly opposes any party seeking tariff exemptions from the U.S. at the expense of Chinese interests. If any country sacrifices China's legitimate interests in the process of reaching an agreement with the U.S., China will respond resolutely. Canada's actions have clearly crossed this line. Before Canada announced its new steel tariffs, Chinese ambassador to Canada Wang Di had already made a clear statement. If Canada cancels its unreasonable and discriminatory tariffs on Chinese products, China's countermeasures can be adjusted. This is not empty talk. In early 2025, China imposed 100% punitive tariffs on Canadian agricultural products like canola and peas, precisely targeting its agricultural lifeblood. 70% of Canada's canola depends on the Chinese market, with an annual surplus of over 4 billion Canadian dollars. More importantly, China has launched an anti-discrimination investigation, systematically reviewing Canada's barriers in areas like technical certification and investment access. If Canada continues to provoke in the steel sector, China is fully capable of escalating countermeasures, and Canadian agriculture and fisheries will bear the brunt. Of course, for China, Canada's shift does not mean a breakdown in China-Canada relations, but it certainly calls for increased vigilance. At present, China is already facing a trend of encirclement in the trade sector from multiple countries in the US and Europe. The supply chain security agreement signed between the US and the UK, as well as the rules of origin negotiations with Vietnam and India, are essentially all about how to exclude China from the global high-value-added industrial chain. The recent increase in tariffs by the EU on Chinese electric vehicles also sends a similar signal. Against this backdrop, Canada's new measures can be seen as a continuation of this trend. China needs to stand firm, take legitimate and reasonable countermeasures, clearly communicate its position, and at the same time avoid overreacting. This helps avoid unnecessary confrontation. How the situation develops depends on whether Canada reassesses its interests and boundaries, and if it maintains neutrality and independence amid the complex international landscape. If it blindly follows the US, China will adopt policies to safeguard its interests.